Jill. I'm Stephanie Strathy. I'm the Associate Dean of Global Health Sciences and the Harold Simon Professor in the Department of Medicine, but I'm also the co-founder, along with Chip Schooley, and co-director of our Center for Innovative Phage Applications and Therapeutics. And together with our division, we are welcoming a very special guest today. That's Diane Shader-Smith. She is a publicist, a writer, and author. Also a fundraiser. She and her husband, Mark, have fundraised over $5 million for the CF Foundation. And importantly, she and Mark made the inaugural donation to iPath to get us rolling 2 years ago. We have a very special relationship with Diane and her family, as you're going to hear from her story, which I think is a must-see for any physician or aspiring physician, any caregiver, and any parent. So Diane, we're just thrilled to have you with us today. I know that you've given this presentation over 175 times to grand rounds all around the country. And the book that Mallory Smith wrote that you made and published, Salt in My Soul, An Unfinished Life, has become a bestseller. And so we look forward to sharing your experience today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to say hi to everybody, share my screen, and I'm going to block myself because during the talk, I just want you to look at the slides. And then after, Stephanie, you're muted if you're saying something. Okay, so, and then after I'll come back on. So just give me 1 minute to just, no, okay, one more second. Okay, now do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, sorry. Okay, we had a rehearsal, I don't know what happened. Okay, so Stephanie and to everyone here, thank you so much for having me today. I won't go into how Stephanie and Chip and I know each other now because it will come out in my talk, which I have given all over the country. So I think I've made Stephanie and Chip household names. Okay, I'm gonna start the story in 1995 when my daughter Mallory was 3 and she was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. Okay, it would help if my slides moved. There we go. The CF specialist told us about the medicines and machines she would need and the limitations that she would face. He seemed hopeful when he said that the lifespan for children with CF has increased from 5 to 25 and that he expected it to get even longer. But all Mark and I heard was that our child had an expiration date. I was bawling my eyes out, and so I asked the doctor how he dealt with hysterical parents and very sick children. His perspective helped me a lot. He said he had been treating kids who had been beaten by their own parents, burned, or abandoned. He saw the love we had for Mallory and the smile on her face, and he promised us that she would have a happy life. Mallory had a lot of symptoms, a persistent cough, a chronic runny nose, and serious GI problems. But she would come to say over time, the doctors are only focused on my lungs because that's what's going to kill me. But the GI problems are what ruined my life. I was desperate for a way to explain the disease to Mallory and to her brother Micah, but there was no children's book about CF back then, so I wrote one. It's called Mallory's 65 Roses. 65 Roses is what kids hear when adults say cystic fibrosis. That first year, Mallory hated doing treatment. Every day when it was time to start, she would hide in the closet, under the bed, anywhere she thought we wouldn't find her. So Mark made up a game he called Astronaut and Pat Pat. Astronaut was for the mask that delivered her inhaled medications, and Pat Pat was for the chest percussion therapy. We read the book to Mallory's class every September, gave a copy to each of her friends and even the boys when she started dating because it provided an easy way to explain her illness, which for so long was invisible. This book taught Mallory the power of narrative. My daughter had a happy childhood, and when she got used to treatment, she was always compliant. But one day when she was 9, she refused to do them anymore. So for the first time, we introduced the idea that CF could be fatal and explained it's why she had to do treatment. She listened carefully and then ran out of the room crying. She did not speak to us for 3 days, but after that, she never missed a treatment. And it's when she started writing, first in a notebook, then at the age of 15 on a computer. Mallory lived every day knowing she had a chronic illness that would someday kill her. It's why she kept a journal. Through the years, Mallory's medical teams became a huge part of our lives, and they often asked if med students and residents could come to her room for bedside training. Mallory always said yes. She was always engaged. They called her the poster child for compliance, and every single doctor loved her. But they did not always love me, because I was the bad cop to Mallory's good cop. My job was to protect her, even when it made me unpopular. There were so many things I did that got me into trouble. I'll share a few. I was known to block the door to Mallory's hospital room before 6 a.m. when they wanted to empty her trash, write her daily goals on the board, or drop off her medications when she had been up until after midnight doing treatment because a nurse had had a coding patient, the pharmacy was backed up with systemic delays, or there was a late night admit. Sleep does not seem to be valued in the hospital, and so I fought for it. I used to sneak Mallory out of the hospital to get her hair washed or to take a walk, even though protocol dictates you can't leave. But I felt it was important to keep her mentally as well as physically healthy. I used to sneak her beloved dog Kona in at night because pet therapy is great medicine. And I would push for faster response times when delays put Mallory's care at risk. And then there was my husband, Mark, who would sleep bedside when I needed a break. He was the more patient one between the two of us, but when things happened at the hospital on his watch, he would get really angry too. During the day shift, there are layers of staff and management is always watching, but at night, it always feels like a ghost town. With no system of checks and balances, this is when the mistakes seem to happen. The ICU also posed problems, and it's not really relevant during COVID, but for those of you who are at the beginning of your journey, it will come up. Many hospitals require loved ones to leave during shift change. This policy doesn't make any sense at all, because when the outgoing nurse is giving notes to the incoming nurse, and if both nurses are doing their job of sharing critical information, then they're diverting their attention from the patient. Mallory never wanted to be left alone in the ICU, and shift change was the scariest time for her, precisely when family or friends should be there. Our advocacy to remain at the bedside led to many fights. And these examples lead to the first insight, which seems like a big fat duh. Parents play an important role in treating a child with chronic illness. This might seem just so very obvious, but what I learned from reading Mallory's journal is that when Mark and I fought with the team, it was the most traumatic for Mallory. And that makes sense. When the two most important support systems a patient relies on are at odds, it creates stress for the patient. When Mallory was 12, she was colonized by B. cepacia, a normally harmless bacteria that wreaks havoc in CF lungs. It's the ultimate superbug, and doctors warned us that things would get way more difficult. To set the tone for Mallory's life, I adopted the mantra, no pity party. My goal was to help Mallory find joy in every day. Mallory went on to adopt her own mantra, which was live happy. Family was always important to Mallory. She and her brother Micah were very close. In high school, she had lots of friends. She was a straight A student, a 3-sport athlete in volleyball, swimming, and water polo, and she was selected to be prom queen. Second half of senior year, Mallory got very sick and was admitted through pediatrics. It was so cheerful, with large photos of furry animals adorning the walls. But about 10 days in, they said they needed the bed for a young pediatric patient, and they moved Mallory to the adult floor. Gone was the cheerful decor, replaced by stark white walls with no playful pictures. It was an abrupt change and a foreshadowing of what adult care would be like. That admission was long, marked by raging fevers and a bad bout with sepsis. Nurses working the front lines during this current pandemic report seeing panic in the eyes of their COVID patients. Their descriptions mirror Mallory's feelings about this long and scary hospitalization. A social worker introduced Mallory to the idea of a worry box, a place to put your grief and your fear. The theory is that writing down your worries and putting them in a box allows you to let them go. You open the box when you want to sit with the feelings, and you close them when you want to move forward. For Mallory, sitting with her feelings propelled her to write, I am in the intermediate ICU wing of the medical center, and as the days wear on, I find myself panicking as I grow more oxygen dependent, experiencing pain with breathing, no longer able to walk without help. Terrifying hospitalizations like this one had distilled for Mallory a profound understanding of how lucky she was to be alive, how precarious her life was. But finally, Mallory got out and she was able to graduate with her high school class. The summer before college, Mallory was deeply stressed because for the first time, she had to think about when and how to tell new people in college about her illness. Mallory's perennial smile belied her anguish. She writes, Quote, I'm living a double life right now, the life of someone with a serious illness and serious complications, but also the life of a student, a friend, an athlete. When Mallory arrived at Stanford in the fall of 2010, she was very nervous, but fortunately dorm living has a way of establishing immediate intimacy, and word spread quickly, relieving Mallory of the burden of disclosure. But still, it was a difficult transition. After growing up with a helicopter mom, Mallory desperately wanted to be independent. But at the same time, she knew having our help made things easier. She had to learn how to juggle academic, social, and medical responsibilities to fit everything in. Over time, she adjusted, studied hard, went to football games, and played club volleyball, despite many dozens of hospitalizations. In total, there would be 67, with admissions ranging from weeks to months. Mallory, like so many others, suffered from the duck syndrome. When students are like ducks gliding on the water, what no one sees is that underneath they are paddling furiously. Mallory would write, quote, the stress of working to make things seem effortless creates a vicious cycle of silence and struggle. This applies to physical and mental health issues. Mallory had both. To manage her anxiety, she spent time in nature whenever possible and cared deeply about the environment. In her senior thesis, Mallory compares the degradation of her lungs by the colonization of a superbug to the degradation of native Hawaii by the colonization of foreigners. Mallory recorded the piece as a podcast called Biome, and it was played on NPR. The analogy Mallory draws helped her process what was happening to her body. It was terrifying. Of her fears, Mallory writes, quote, my memory, nearly photographic at times, serves me well in school, but it curses me at night. My internal hallucinations are so haunting, I can't escape them, even when I close my eyes, because the images play on my eyelids as if projected on a movie screen. It's scary to think I might look back and realize I could have done amazing things, but didn't because fear held me back. Fear protects us from dangerous things. Unwarranted fear prevents us from reaching our full potential. It has been crushing to me to learn that Mallory suffered so much. Her emotional pain was never, ever addressed until I pushed hard for a psych consult. Doctors were so focused on her survival that they missed the signs of mental distress. Despite her demons, Mallory did reach her potential and graduated from Stanford Phi Beta Kappa, so excited to do field research. But sadly, the doctors said no to every project she asked about because exposure to environmental toxins would further damage her lungs. She was devastated. No one understood her distress. Mallory still looked so healthy that many thought she was the golden girl who had it all. But she would have traded everything for the chance to take a breath that didn't hurt, to have a life that wasn't defined by illness. As her body deteriorated, she sharpened her mind, crystallized her thinking, and honed her writing skills. Mallory would write, I'm limited in what I can do, but not in what I can say. Cystic fibrosis does a lot of taking, of dreams, of time, of travel, of friendships, of freedom, of potential, of plans, of lives. But you can't be negative. Negative feelings hurt creativity, the very same creativity that will help you reinvent your possibilities and achieve your ends. Mallory fought hard to reinvent her possibilities without giving up on the dream of working in environmental education. Instead of doing field work, she got hired to write a book, The Gottlieb Native Garden, a California love story about the importance of using native plants and gardening for wildlife. Conservation, even to those committed to stewardship, can seem unobtainable. The publication of this book enabled Mallory to realize that she could still make a difference despite her own limitations. The book received a lot of acclaim, but when Mallory should have been celebrating on book tour, her infection reignited, landing her back in the hospital for a long stretch of time. While her friends were grappling with normal post-college questions, Mallory was dealing with IVs, ICUs, and indignities, like having doctors, nurses, residents ask her about her bowel habits in front of her friends, even when she repeatedly asked them not to. It was humiliating. Mallory was also in excruciating pain, 3 different times, 3 different hospitals, once for pleurisy, once for a pulmonary embolism, and then again after transplant. The opioid epidemic has left the medical community working to regain control over prescribing patterns, As a result, well-meaning doctors would routinely underprescribe pain meds to Mallory out of their fears of creating another addict, even though she was an inpatient and doctors were monitoring every dose. Mallory writes about her distress at inadequate pain management, and yet, at another point, she writes about her own fears of getting addicted. Quote, "I never thought I would say this, but I have come to love the feeling of being on opioids. They were never part of my treatment, but as my chest pain became unbearable, I needed them to breathe. They also helped with my mood. With morphine and oxy, there is no pain, there is no sadness." These anecdotes lead to insight number 2, which is fear of addiction must be better balanced with need when it comes to pain management. Advocating for better pain management protocols is part of Mallory's unfinished work and part of her unfinished life. After college, the issue of when to disclose her invisible illness surfaced again. She worried about burdening new friends and about scaring potential employers. In one anecdote, Mallory interviewed for a writing job with a company who said she was perfect and loved her sample submissions. They offered her a great job with a high salary. But after she told them that she had CF, they decided it wasn't a good fit and withdrew their offer. She was devastated. Mallory also feared no man would love her enough to accept the complications of her disease, so she often held back. But there was something about Jack, who we call her real-life Prince Charming, that left her wrestling with the decision. They first met on New Year's Eve in 2015. Mallory had just gotten out of the hospital and she was on IVs. She thought Jack was super cute and very nice, but since she was living in LA and he was living in Palo Alto, she didn't give him a second thought. Having a long-distance relationship with so many medical complications seemed impossible. But months later, after Mallory moved back, they re-met at a party and they were playing a game of spike ball when she felt a bout of hemoptysis coming on, so she ran into the bathroom to cough up blood. When she came out, she had blood on her shirt and was very pale. Jack expressed concern, which leads to insight number 3. It's difficult to know when to disclose an invisible illness. Mallory came to the conclusion that there is no right or wrong in terms of timing. But with Jack, she decided to disclose right away for 2 reasons. First, she wanted to know, is this person who's there when I'm lighthearted and laughing also going to be there for me when I'm sick or sedated? Second, she wanted him to know what he was getting into. And it's a good thing she told Jack right away, because a few days later, she ended up in the hospital. It was the first of many more back-to-back admissions to come. The antibiotics had stopped working, and the only option left was transplant. The 2 centers where she had been a patient for most of her life turned her down. In fact, they wouldn't even evaluate her. Mallory was crushed. They also said they didn't think any other center would take her complicated case, so she felt quite abandoned by her CF teams. I regret that I did not push harder for them to have a conversation with her. Didn't they owe her that? I begged the team to keep trying to find a hospital that would evaluate her. And with little hope, and while we waited, we decided to stop treatment and take a trip to Hawaii. If she was going to die, I wanted her to be in her happy place near the ocean. For 6 magical days, Mallory was oxygen and IV free. She got to surf, swim, paddleboard. But on day 7, the fever started and shot up to 103.5. Mallory was admitted to the Maui hospital, but they didn't know anything about Cepacia or have any of the medications she needed. So we asked her brother Micah to fly to Oahu. He did and returned with 60 pounds of IV balls. We were going to stay put until Mallory was stable to fly. But then the national news announced the worst hurricane in decades was headed straight for Maui. And so we were scrambling to get one of the last planes out before they closed the airport. In the midst of all this chaos, we got a call from UPMC that Mallory had been approved for evaluation. She was all smiles despite her high fever. I was ecstatic, but the coordinator said not to get excited yet. She'd seen too many people get approved for evaluation, but then be denied coverage. I said, that won't happen. My husband is a lawyer and he has fought every denial and won. And I'm a publicist and I will be on the Today Show exposing their refusal to pay. But as it turns out, she was denied. Getting insurance approval for an out-of-state, out-of-network hospital was the most excruciating non-medical challenge we ever faced. The battle raged for weeks. They employed multiple stall tactics that Mallory felt were intended to run the clock out on her life. It was going to take a miracle to turn that no into a yes. We did get the miracle. It came in the form of a close friend who knew someone at the highest level of our insurance company's management. Mallory did not want to accept the evaluation because she felt guilty that others with CF had not been able to overturn their denials and had died waiting. I urged Mallory to use her privilege, her access, and the power of the pen to expose this injustice. She documents the entire battle and writes that insurance companies are inflicting needless additional stress on patients who are already suffering. It's outrageous and incomprehensible, and it leads to insight number 4, which is that doctors and not insurance company should decide what kind of care their patient needs and where to get it. In early October of 2016, Mallory and I flew to Pittsburgh for a grueling week, meeting the various teams that had to weigh in on her case. We were on pins and needles waiting to hear from the transplant team. They had said they'd call Monday or Tuesday, but they didn't, and we were highly anxious. They finally called on Wednesday, Mallory's 24th birthday, to say they were accepting her as a candidate for transplant, but that at 40% lung function, she was still just a bit too healthy to fly across the country. We were so happy to have more time. But in a twist of fate, 1 week later, Mallory got the flu and mono, and then UPMC said she might not be able to be transplanted after all. She was just too sick. There is a fine line between being too sick and not sick enough. Mallory stayed in the hospital for most of November, December, and January until she was finally stable to fly. The call came in early February on a Monday with instructions to fly on Thursday so Mallory could be in clinic on Friday, which gave us 2 days to pack up our lives for the cross-country move and say goodbye to everyone, knowing she might not make it back. This is the day we left for Pittsburgh. Mallory was happy and hopeful when we landed. To a patient with end-stage lung disease, the most important call you'll ever get is the one letting you know that lungs are available. But that call can come days, weeks, months, or even years after you're listed. Once you are listed, every time the phone rings, you jump. You can't exercise, shower, watch a movie, or sleep through the night without your phone right there with you, which intensifies the experience, but you can't miss a single call. As the days and weeks pass, your heightened vigilance gives way to hopelessness because you start to feel like the call will never come, or if it does come, it'll come too late. At that point, I changed my mantra to somewhere over the rainbow there are lungs, and I used to sing that first line to her over and over and over. About 6 weeks later, the call came. We packed, raced to the hospital, and waited 24 hours. But in the morning, when the surgeon came in to tell us that the lungs were viable, he told us they were going to another patient. Talk about being blindsided. We didn't know Mallory was a backup candidate. We didn't even know that that was a thing. And that leads to insight number 5, which is that doctors should err in favor of giving more information rather than less, as it helps patients and their families manage their expectations. In total, Mallory experienced 3 dry runs, false alarms where you're called to the hospital and prepped for transplant, but the lungs aren't viable or they go to someone else. Mallory writes about the emotional and physical toll this took on her. But finally, on September 11 of 2017, Mallory got the 4th and final call. Despite her fear, Mallory was so excited. She was wheeled in for a 9-hour surgery and received the gift of life, new lungs. The recovery was grueling, but 1 month later, she was celebrating her 25th birthday. Those days, I used to sing to her, somewhere over the rainbow there were lungs. And you can see the rainbow on her cake and the smile on her face. It was the happiest time as we dared to dream about a new life back in California. But tragically, just a few weeks later, Mallory was readmitted with pneumonia and doctors started preparing me for the worst. They wanted me to tell Mallory she wasn't going to make it. I refused. Mallory was terrified of dying. I did not want her to be afraid. The doctors in every specialty in that hospital disagreed with my choice, creating yet another point of contention. But we needed Mallory to have hope. In these last days of Mallory's life, Mark was working around the clock to get an experimental treatment for her. Mark had read about Stephanie Strathy saving her husband, that phage therapy had been used 100 years ago. But then penicillin was discovered. With its patent protection and financial incentives, penicillin rendered work on phage obsolete. Since phages are naturally occurring organisms, patent protection would be a huge challenge. So Mark enlisted the help of Stephanie Strathy, who worked with Dr. Chip Schooley and they had joined forces to see what they could do to help. On November 7th, she sent out this nationwide tweet, and many labs responded. Meanwhile, at the doctor's urging, our closest friends and family gathered. Because Mallory was on a ventilator, she scribbled this note I saved, which says, "Can't talk at all, but so grateful you are all here for the hardest part." On November 14, the United States Navy found a match for Mallory's isolate of Cepacia. Dr. DeCuna, the transplant surgeon from UPMC, came up with an elaborate plan to send their organ retrieval plane and then a helicopter to get it from the Navy's lab to the airport and then to the hospital. We were so happy and hopeful when the phages arrived. That night, Mallory made history and became the first patient with CF to receive phage therapy. But the very next morning, doctors advised us that Mallory had been without oxygen for too long and advised us to make the gut-wrenching decision to remove life support. After she died, we asked for an autopsy and learned that the phages had started to work. She just didn't get them in time. Mark and Stephanie were not able to save Mallory, but they were certain that phage therapy could save others. So we shared Mallory's story with the media, a story that starts in 2016 with my husband's dogged pursuit of this treatment and includes the role Stephanie played by saving her own husband. Excuse me. Stat News reported that Mallory died, but her bacterial infection lived on, moving from her ICU room in Pittsburgh to a lab in Ann Arbor, and then on to Jerusalem, where 3 students found a second phage that was effective against Mallory's strain of Cepacia. They named the bacteria-killing virus BC Mallory 1, using the initials of the bacteria it's active against, and my daughter's name since she inspired the search. While this was happening, Mark was dipping for phages in a sewage treatment plant and bringing phage therapy and Stephanie Strathy to the attention of Dr. Mike Boyle and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, because he had a vision to treat kids with CF with phage therapy before infection ravaged their lungs, a vision that has led to the first NIH-funded clinical trial for patients with CF. Helping others in the fight has helped Mark with his grief. As for me, I turned to Mallory's journal. In the last months of her life, she had given me the password. When I opened it, I found 2,500 pages of her reflections over 10 years. The playful writings of a teenager, the somber insights of a young woman facing death, and instructions to publish the parts that might help others. Mallory writes in detail about her treatments and hospital stays, the love and unexpected community she found in hospitals, the transcendent intimacy she developed with her beloved doctors and the care team, and the problems imposed by the medical system she depended upon to live. Which leads to the last insight I'll share, which is that a life-threatening illness puts you at the intersection of so many public health issues and turns you into an accidental expert about the ways patient care can and should be improved. Mallory's writing highlights areas in patient care that need addressing. For example, the power every single caregiver has to make daily decisions that affect a patient's quality of life. The doctors, the nurses, the RTs, PTs, pharmacists, case managers, home health nurses, all of them, and it's a very long list. People asked if I learned anything from reading Mallory's journal. The big surprise to me was that her facade of perfection masked a darker truth about experiences and emotions she had not dared to share publicly. Mallory lived happy, but in her journal, she expresses anger at her disease, shame about her body and its failings, and the difficulty of straddling the sick and well worlds. Despite the serious subject matter, Salt in My Soul is still at its core a snapshot of a coming of age, an intimate portrait of a young woman living her life. She writes about topics that so many of us relate to: the importance of deep and meaningful friendships, her longing for love, and most heartbreaking to me, her intense desire to have a child. Mallory said that writing helped heal her. If only she had gotten to see that her writing is healing others. She leaves a legacy in her wisdom and her words, the salt in her soul. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Diane, I've heard your presentation before, and I just never expected it every single time. It gets me right in the heart. There are 74 people that have watched this, but I want to also thank you, not just for giving this presentation today and every time you give it, I know the emotional toll it can take telling this story because I do it myself, but you also gave a copy of Salt in My Soul to every incoming medical student at UC San Diego. And for that, I thank you as well. And I know my husband, Tom, is online as well, and he thanks you for being here. Just two notes while we're waiting for questions, feel free to add in the chat any questions that you have, and Jill and I will moderate. But I did want to acknowledge Chip Schooley, who's the co-director of IPATH with me, is the principal investigator of the first NIH-funded phage therapy trial that will begin enrolling patients at UC San Diego in 2021. It will be among cystic fibrosis patients with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Dr. Saima Aslam, who's also one of our faculty in ID transplant doc, received some funding from the CF Foundation to build a library for Burkholderia cepacia, the exact same pathogen that took down Mallory. And it will allow us to hopefully match phage to patients like Mallory much faster. If there's other comments or questions, we'll wait for them to come in through chat. We have several minutes. If Chip is still on, or if Saima or any of our other IPATH physicians would like to comment or ask a question, we welcome that now.
I will say one thing, having done this, many times, and I see somebody wrote this in the chat room. I think that what I used to say when I would give this talk is that I either did such a good job that nobody has any questions, or I did such a bad job that nobody has any questions, and that would always get a laugh. But what I have come to understand is that people are processing the story, and it does take a while, and I give a lot of information, and so I
Diane, this is Saima. Thank you very much for sharing your story and Mallory's story. As Stephanie said, I mean, it really is heartbreaking. I also had a personal loss, and my husband passed away several years ago. And I agree with the things you say in terms of how doctors treat patients, things that we don't see from, the patient's perspective or the family perspective. And I really appreciate you sharing these things, regardless of whether we're an infectious disease physician or transplant or whatever. But I believe, having these experiences and learning from others, as Mallory has shared hers, really helps us to take care of our next patients so much better and give them so much more dignity than just a case. And each patient truly is a person. And sometimes I think, as a profession, sometimes we lose sight of that. So I really appreciate you sharing this with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Saima. We have one question. There's lots of comments and words of thanks. Is phage research more likely to get better funding in other countries with less focus on patents and commodification of healthcare and treatments? I'm not sure if Chip is still on. I know he might have gotten pulled into a meeting, but if he is there, this would be a perfect question for him. But I can say that it's taken some time for phage research to, phage therapy research, that is, to get attention. In the 1950s and 60s, and even up until now, the study of phage in biology has gone on. I mean, just yesterday, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of CRISPR. Without phage, CRISPRs would not have been identified. So, but the application of phages for phage therapy was forgotten, partly because phage were discovered before penicillin. Some of the early research was poor. Penicillin and subsequent antibiotics were seen to be game changers, and of course they were for a while. And then it was taken up by the former Soviet Union, and around World War II, and of course the geopolitical bias that against Russia as an enemy led to this cloud over phage therapy that hung over it till this day. But with luminaries like Chip, and with the help and stories and advocacy from people like Diane and Tom, my husband, we have presented, for example, at ID Week. We did the closing plenary, and I had people come up to me afterwards and say, this was a game changer for us. The light bulb has gone off. And people like Saima have published every single case study and case series. And so we're at the point now where the NIH has funded not just one, but 2 clinical trials. So, and of course, the first genetically modified phage cocktail to be successfully used in a human being that also involved Chip from iPath last year was published. And that is lending support to biotech and pharmas who are getting into this space. So for example, Janssen invested $800 million in a phage company in North Carolina last year and is moving that into clinical trials for UTIs. So I think that it is changing, but it has been slower because, you know, the field still tends to gravitate towards small molecules rather than other anti-infectives like phage.
Stephanie, this is Connie. Can I?
Oh, yes, please do, Connie.
Just to build on Stephanie's comments with a couple of additional ones about the space for commercializing phage therapy. I think one of the challenges is that for what we have been able to build through iPath, most of the patients that we've been able to treat have been individual patients using an what you've all come to know now as an emergency use authorization for individual phages. And as you heard from Mallory's story, very often we have to tailor each individual patient's bacteria to a cocktail of phages that match those bacteria and are active against it, which adds some challenges to the developmental process for making something commercially available on a wider scale. There are a lot of different pathways that are being evaluated now, many through iPath and through the work that Chip and Saima and Stephanie are doing to try and make it easier to access a cocktail that won't require some of the back and forth individual tailoring of a cocktail of phage to an individual bacteria. And that gives the sort of pharmaceutical industry a better sense of how this could be utilized. So I think we're moving down a path where the patent issues may be less of a challenge than the actual scaling up of the ability to use phage cocktails as adjunctive therapy for resistant organisms. But I think we're moving down that pathway very quickly, and hopefully we'll be able to make this available to a broader swath of people who have multi-drug resistant organisms. I also just want to give a shout out to our colleagues at University of Pittsburgh in a different way. We've been also working on phage therapy for mycobacterial infections and trying to tackle as one of the multi-drug resistant pathogens that has caused serious illness and death across the world, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And so our colleagues at University of Pittsburgh have joined us in iPath in developing phages that are active against mycobacterial infections. So I think there's a lot to cover in phage therapy. There's a lot of opportunities. And I'll just close for a moment by highlighting the fact that we're joined this morning by 5 young physicians who are applying for fellowships in infectious diseases, and they're just embarking on a career in infectious diseases. And I think, Diane, all we can do is thank you so much for what is got to be one of the most touching stories we've heard through our HIV and global health rounds for a long time. And hopefully it will be inspiring to our young physicians who are embarking on a career in such a wonderful subspecialty that we could contribute in a way to Mallory's story. So
Thanks very much, Connie. I know that Diane wants to respond. So Diane?
Well, one thing that's completely heartbreaking to me is that I've been getting calls for 3 years since Mallory passed away. In November, it will be 3 years. people desperate at the end of their life looking for phage therapy. And for a while there in the beginning, they were doing compassionate use and expanded access. And then that was sort of shut down and there's all the politics behind that. But it was interesting when President Trump was getting medications for his COVID through that, I thought, okay, maybe they're going to start understanding why this is really important to be able to do that. My perspective is you learn stuff in clinical trials, but you also learn things through compassionate use. And then you have a chance to share the story like we did with Mallory, which I think has moved the needle, because I personally connected at least 7 different doctors, ID doctors from different hospitals that I spoke at, gave this talk. They'd never heard of phage therapy, and I connected them to Stephanie immediately after, usually right there in the hospital. And they decided they were going to start doing that. And there is a documentary being made about Mallory, and we have a slide now that talks about phage therapy at the end and all the progress that's been made. But that said, what's devastating to me is that since Mallory died, a girl was given a double lung transplant, I think 2 weeks after Mallory in 2017 with the superbug Cepacia, and had a much better first and second year. And I got a call from her brother about 2 weeks ago who said he was beside himself because he found his sister in the same situation Mallory was in, and his 90-year-old father had been sitting bedside since July. And I said to my husband, why is their daughter still alive when Mallory, they told us to pull the plug after a week, which that's a whole other story. But it was interesting for me to hear the case. And I immediately connected him to Stephanie, and I know the wheels are in motion. But what made me so sad is that it's 3 years later, it's the same case, the same story, and UPMC is jumping on board and trying to help, but they haven't identified the phages. And the son sent me the ID doctor's email, which basically talked about the timeline of how long it's going to take, and I don't know if she's going to make it. And I find it heartbreaking to think that it's been 3 years with everything we know. Why are things not further along? My understanding from Stephanie and from the doctors at Yale is that it has to do with money, which is why we've been fundraising and donating everything, because there is no ability to work on these in the labs if there's no money to pay for it. And I think the NIH funding a trial is fantastic, but I don't understand why the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which has billions of dollars, has not spent more money. And I would advise people putting pressure on them to release more funds to do more work, because it seems to me that's what it's all about.
Diane, sorry.
Good. I was just going to call for you, Simon. Thanks.
Oh. Yeah. So I totally 100% agree. I think Burkholderia cepacia is a particularly hard bug to find phages for, or even antibiotics for. And I think because it's so rare, what you pointed out was correct. There weren't that many people interested, because at least from a commercial viewpoint, I think commercial groups are not interested because they don't think they're going to have enough patients to treat. So I think the grant we got from Cystic Fibrosis Foundation from Mallory Smith's Legacy Fund will go a long way in helping develop this library. So patients, like Mallory, instead of having this last minute rush to find a phage, which may or may not work, our goal is to actually enroll patients that are not very sick, and try to find phages for them up front and be able to treat them when they need it, so that it's already available. And so the patient that you mentioned, we're trying to help as well, and have sent her bacterial isolates to a number of labs. But yes, the hope is moving forward that we'll have a library of Cepacia phages, so that we're able to treat patients without the long delay that Mallory faced and others are facing.
And Simon, just to follow up on what Simon and Connie have both mentioned, is that for reasons that we don't totally understand about microbial ecology, for some reasons, we tend to identify only temperate phage or predominantly temperate phage rather than lytic phage. I consider lytic phage in our book, The Perfect Predator, I describe it as the kind that undergo phage rage. They enter the bacterial cell, turn it into a phage manufacturing plant. All the baby virions are assembled, and when given the kill signal, they burst out and go on to attack other phage other bacteria that they match to. But with temperate phage, the phage attach, enter the bacterial cell, and their genetic material integrates with the bacterial cell DNA and hits the snooze button is the way I think about it. And those phage can carry antimicrobial resistance genes, toxin genes. They also can collude essentially with the bacterial cell to make the bacterial cell resistant to attack from other phages. And of course, they don't kill the bacterial cells. So ideally, we do not want to use temperate phage, but if it's all we can find, then there are ways now through either recombinering or through CRISPR-Cas gene editing to convert those temperate phage into lytic phages. And that's what was exactly done in the case of the Isabel Cornell Holdaway that was published in I think it was PLOS Medicine last May. Chip was involved in that case. So that was not only the first genetically modified phage cocktail to be used in a human being successfully, but it was also a Mycobacterium abscessus case. And Mycobacterium, as Connie mentioned, is a primary focus because Mycobacterium tuberculosis, as you're all aware, is the biggest bacterial killer in the world, with almost 2 million people dying every year of that. So if we could use phage therapy someday to treat tuberculosis, that would be a game changer. Connie is leading this effort at IPATH to try to build a Mycobacterium library in concert with colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, led by Dr. Graham Hatfull. And those phages have actually been crowdsourced by students in the C-Phages program. We have a C-Phages program at UCSD. There's 3 others within the UC system. We've just applied for funding at the UC Office of the President to expand IPATH across the UC Health schools so that we can offer it across California more readily, but also using C-phages. Students that are being taught microbiology and virology identify unique phages they get to name, they learn how to characterize and sequence them, they go into a phage library that could be used to treat humans. And that's what was done with Isabel's case. And so Connie will be focusing more attention on this, and we welcome fellows that want to get involved, because this is really going to be the future, is with these difficult pathogens like Burkholderia and Mycobacteria, we will likely need to genetically manipulate them to optimize phage lifestyle.
And then just to circle back, Mycobacterium abscessus is a very common chronic pathogen in people with cystic fibrosis as well, and very difficult to treat. And another one of the young women who underwent a double lung transplant and was treated with phage against Mycobacterium abscessus is actually back to a normal life in the UK after chronic therapy with bacteriophage against her Mycobacterium abscessus. So I think it tells us that if we approach this in a proactive and very aggressive way, we can turn things around for people like Mallory, who so sadly wasn't able to get access to phage in time.
Thank you, Connie. If there's no other questions or comments, we'll close for today. But I know, Diane, for me personally, and my husband Tom, and for all of us at IPATH, Mallory lives on in our hearts. I know that it might sound trite or as a trope, but I mean, literally, I think about her every day. I never met her. I never got to talk to her because when I first was connected to your family, she couldn't breathe. But her legacy has really made a difference, and it has helped other cystic fibrosis patients learn about phage therapy. And as a result, cystic fibrosis patients are really advocating and leading the charge for this. And that's sometimes how breakthroughs occur. And I'm confident that we're going to continue to do this. Diane, you said you want to say one more thing. Go ahead.
Well, to the point of fundraising and to the point of speaking up and advocating, Emily Golenkoff-Kramer, who I know is giving you a lot of money to develop the lab, knows about phage therapy from Mallory. I have the text exchange between the two of them where Mallory first told Emily about 4 or 5 years ago about phage therapy. Emily knew nothing about it. And because of that conversation and Mallory pushing and making Mallory's case public, she has now come forward with a ton of funding that's making it happen. So I think it's super important to keep talking and keep sharing the story. And I say to Mallory, if she's listening, that everybody's paying attention. But the main thing is, you know, people always tell me they love the talk. And I say, well, if they love the talk, read the book, because the book is really insightful. I just pull from the book in order to prepare a talk to get people to read. But we are donating all profits from the book. And that's how we were, you know, we were able to get for my birthday, I asked people, instead of giving me gifts, to donate to Learn. And Learn was the group that made the books for the students possible, because for me, that's really what it's all about.
Thanks again, Diane. I did want to mention that this talk is being recorded, and it's appropriate that you mentioned that Emily's entourage was inspired through Mallory to donate also to iPath. That Dr. David Pride is leading that effort to develop a phage library for MRSA, and he's been quite successful in collaborating worldwide with phage researchers in the US, the Europe, and also Israel. So thanks everybody for joining us. I think that this is something that we're never going to forget, this talk. I'm really glad that we recorded it so that we can share it with others. Thank you very much.